So for our journey along the internal carotid, we'll be navigating using what's known as the Boutier or the Van Loveren classification, which is numbered from proximal to distal following blood flow. So now we'll shrink ourselves down and take on the perspective of the carotid as if we were a red blood cell going through. And we begin in the first segment, which starts at a fork in the road. So we're coming up, and if you close your eyes, you're coming up and you see a fork. And we can either go to the more medial or to the more lateral. This travels up the neck, so hence the C1 is the cervical segment. And it begins at the bifurcation and goes all the way up to the entrance into the carotid canal. So the first segment of the ICA is the C1 cervical segment, which is long. Travels straight up from the bifurcation until the entrance into the carotid canal. So when you come to that fork in the road, you can either go to the internal or the external carotid. So we're going to go obviously into the internal carotid. And as we enter the tunnel of the carotid canal, we also enter the Petrous bone. And this is unsurprisingly the C2 or the Petrous segment of the ICA. And for a moment, we continue to travel upward before we encounter the first genu, the first major bend of the carotid. As we come up and approach the Petrous apex, we take a very sharp, almost 90-degree turn anteromedially, all within the Petrous bone. So this is, as we come up right here, this is that first bend, and everything is covered by bone here. We're passing a lot of important structures of the middle ear and the internal auditory canal. So we're coming up and we're having that first big bend. And as we do, we're coming back to a view that we now know. The bone is removed. And we can see the carotid right here as it emerges from this first bend underneath the GSPN that we saw before. So this is the same view we have up here, just using the dry skull. So that's our first bend. We come up and over the bend. As we look up, we would see normally bone, but since the bone's been removed, here we look up and we see the GSPN running on top of us. So we know we're running in a lateral to medial direction, ever so slightly anteriorly. So now here, the carotid is, as it would normally be, covered by bone. So if you can imagine, you're sitting here, and you look up, and you see a very thin layer of bone with a very straight and parallel nerve on top of it. And this is our GSPN as it's going from laterally to medially on its way to go underneath V3. So the C2 Petrous segment continues medially, ever so slightly anteriorly within the Petrous bone until going underneath V3 and the trigeminal ganglion, all the way until it reaches the posterior margin of the foramen lacerum. So again, we have C1 from the bifurcation, C1 cervical segment from the bifurcation, all the way up to the entrance into the carotid canal. Then we begin our C2 segment, which begins entering the canal. So we're inside this tunnel of bone. We're going up, up, and then we finally emerge. We turn, and we flatten out, return, up and over, and we're now running medially in the Petrous bone. So we go from the C2 cervical, from the entrance into the carotid canal, to the posterior margin of the foramen lacerum. And during this course, the C2 segment gives off two branches. The first is the caroticotympanic artery to the middle ear, and the other is the Vidian artery, which is going to go in the Vidian canal, which would be here. Here is the Petrous segment zoomed in with the trigeminal removed. So here we can see, to orient ourselves, we have cranial nerve 3. So again, this is the oculomotor nerve. and this is where the oculomotor triangle would be. And it enters the cavernous sinus, exiting the dura on its way to the supraorbital fissure, which would be here. This is fourth nerve, right here, coming in, exiting the dura, entering the cavernous sinus, on its way to the supraorbital fissure. This is a cut V1 right here. Underneath it, we can see sixth nerve. So here's sixth nerve coming up, entering Dorello's canal, going underneath Gruber's ligament. This is where the clivus and the petrous bone meet, right here. So this is where sixth nerve comes in, going on top of the carotid, underneath V1, on its course to the superior orbital fissure. This is V2 cut and V3 cut as well. And as we said earlier, the ICA doesn't pass through the foramen and lacrum, but rather on top of it. So thus, we have the C3, or the lacrum segment, which begins at the posterior margin of the foramen lacrum, and which is roughly beneath V1, or the area between V1 and V2, underneath the trigeminal ganglion. Actually, let's take a moment here. We can see here's fifth nerve from its origin, coming up, going up and over the petrous ridge has been drilled here. So this is the intradural course of 5, going up over that petrous ridge and fanning out so beautifully in the middle fossa, V1, V2, and V3, all of this being the cavernous sinus. Here we have fourth nerve coming all the way around the brainstem from its posterior origin, coming in with that free edge of the tentorium, entering the cavernous sinus. Here's that third nerve course. Again, a little superior origin, coming at a slight angle downwards into the oculomotor triangle, exiting the dura into the cavernous sinus, and all of them going to the superior orbital fissure. You can't really see 6 here. You can see contralateral 3, though, quite nicely. And this is where the posterior clinoid would be. This is the clivus right here, and that's the long axis of the clivus, where we're later going to see the basilar artery. Up here, we have first nerve and second nerve, and the pituitary in the midline. This is our orbit. Everything here, the extraocular muscles, you can see the globe right here. Also, we have the middle meningeal artery coming out of the foramen spinosum right here. Here's 7 and 8 going into the internal auditory canal, and the seventh nerve is coming into the geniculate ganglion, and it's giving off the GSPN that we looked at before. And the GSPN is exiting through the facial hiatus, running very superficially on top of the petrous carotid here. So when you're surgically trying to identify the location of the petrous carotid, the GSPN is really invaluable because it's really perfectly superficial and parallel to. So if you're doing an anterior transpetrosal approach where you're removing a portion of the petrous ridge right here, it's very useful to know how to avoid the carotid. So this is a nice approximation of where the foramen lacrum is, right about V1, V2. And so this is where the carotid has its next major bend. So we had the first major bend as we came up to the into the petrous bone, and we turned medially, and then we ran straight through the petrous bone medially towards the midline, going from the petrous segment to the lacrum segment on top of the foramen lacrum, and now we're going to turn upwards again. We're going to have another one of those really sharp 90-degree angle upward bends as we come in, and as we turn superiorly, I should say. So we're going anteromedial, and then now we're curving superiorly. And as we curve superiorly, we encounter this structure in yellow here. Does anyone know what this structure is? I see there are some questions that came in. I'll answer quickly. The ligament, well, I'll answer after this one. Is the GSPN the same nerve as the pterygoid canal? Yeah, so the GSPN, there are 3 different nerves here. There's the deep petrosal, the lesser petrosal, GSPN comes in, joins with the other, and becomes the nerve of the pterygoid canal, the Vidian nerve. Okay, so the guess here, 32% said this is the petrosphenoidal ligament, and 26% said this is the anterior petroclinoid ligament. No, actually, this is the petrolingual ligament. And you don't really see this much surgically because it's really deep in here. And you really have to remove the, well, in theory, would have to remove the trigeminal to see it. But it has a really nice function because it really holds the carotid inside the region here. It pins the carotid to the bone. So the carotid isn't twisting around and tearing when you're turning your head left to right. So this extends from the petrous apex over here to the lingula of the sphenoid bone. And this is important, not just from an evolutionary standpoint, but because here it denotes where the carotid enters the cavernous sinus. So before this, the carotid is extra cavernous. In here, the carotid enters the cavernous sinus. So again, we have the C1 cervical segment from the carotid bifurcation all the way to the entrance into the carotid canal, straight, no branches. Then we have the C2 or the Petrous segment from the carotid canal up, curving medially inside the petrous bone all the way to the posterior margin of the foramen lacerum. And the C2 segment gives off the caroticotympanic and the Vidian arteries. And then we have the lacerum segment from the posterior margin of foramen lacerum bending upwards superiorly until we go underneath the petrolingual ligament and enter the cavernous sinus. And the C3 lacerum segment does not give off any branches. So now we have the C4, or the cavernous segment, which begins at the petrolingual ligament and continues up, traveling underneath the abducens nerve, which we saw before. Here's our sixth nerve. We can see right here as well, Dorello's canal, Gruber's or the petrosphenoidal ligament up here, petrosphenoidal ligament, petrolingual ligament. And going underneath V1. So as the carotid comes up, as we're going through the carotid, and we come underneath this petrolingual ligament, this sort of archway, we look up and we're going underneath this small two-layered thoroughfare. We have one overpass here with sixth nerve, and on top of that is a little bit larger of an overpass with sixth nerve. As we continue up, we're also going to encounter the much smaller fourth nerve, and then also the pretty large third nerve. So the cavernous ICA then bends inferiorly this time, and it kinks out ever so slightly laterally. So it's going up and then down and then slightly kinking out laterally. And then turning again and going upward until we get to the proximal dural ring. So C4 petrolingual ligament all the way up and then down, slightly lateral, then going back up again. It's almost like an S shape. It's not this perfect in every person, but you usually find at least 1.5 major bends. Maybe not so acute. So we find the proximal, all the way to the proximal dural ring here, which is found just underneath where the anterior clinoid process would be, the so-called clinoid space. And this is where the anterior clinoid process would project. So if you drill it out and you remove it, you have created the clinoid space, which is important if you want to access these structures to cut them and mobilize the carotid laterally, and we'll see why in a minute. Over the course of the cavernous sinus, the cavernous segment here gives off three main branches. The first is the meningohypophyseal trunk over here, then the inferolateral trunk down here, and also some McConnell's capsular arteries on the medial aspect. The meningohypophyseal trunk, the MHT, arises from the posterior aspect of that first downward bend. So we're coming up and then down, and this is the MHT right here. So you can see it's the posterior surface right here, and it's projecting posteromedially. And as we can also see if we keep looking, so that we have that first bend, and now we're coming down, and you can see how the carotid kinks out ever so laterally, ever so slightly laterally, before it turns back up and comes to the proximal dural ring right here. Proximal dural ring is also a nice feature to keep that carotid tethered to the bone. So just looking quickly at the anatomy again here, here's the clivus, right? Here's where the posterior clinoid is on the edge. This is third nerve, so we've come over the posterior clinoid, going down, entering the oculomotor triangle, exiting the dura, entering the cavernous sinus, the SOF, second nerve, as it enters the optic canal. You can see this ridge of dura here is the falciform ligament. Here we have fourth nerve running with that free edge of the tentorium. The free edge is, or the tentorium itself, is cut more posteriorly here, so you can really appreciate the relationship between fourth nerve and the tentorium as it exits the dura, entering the cavernous sinus, also going to the superior orbital fissure. Down here, we have fifth nerve, exiting the dura, entering Meckel's cave, going out into the middle fossa again, and fanning out. And here's sixth nerve right here, and you can see as it goes into Durell's canal, again covered by Gruber's ligament, going underneath V1 on its way to the superior orbital fissure. So here we have the meningohypophyseal trunk. And this trunk consists of 3 to 4 main branches. The first is the inferior hypophyseal artery. So I like to imagine this as we're coming down, or coming up the C4 highway here. This is our first exit ramp, and this can take us to several small towns along the way. So the first one is the inferior hypophyseal artery, and that goes to the pituitary gland. Then we have the artery of Bernasconi and Casanari, which is the tentorial artery, going towards the tentorium, which has been removed here, so we don't really see it. And then we have the dorsal meningeal artery, the dura of the upper clivus, going towards the dura of the upper clivus, as well as some small clival branches scattered throughout. You can really appreciate this branch nicely here. Okay, so just for fun, let's answer a neurosurgery board review question about the MHT. So what is the most constant branch of the MHT? The overwhelming response seems to be the inferior hypophyseal artery. I believe the most constant branch is the artery of Bernasconi and Casanari, or the tentorial artery. But maybe the literature has changed since the last board review book was published. But as far as I know, it's the Italian artery. The artery of Bernasconi and Casanari is the most constant branch. What does most constant mean? It means that what you find most commonly on angio. So what is the most consistently found branch? Okay, so now as we continue down towards the second genu, we find the inferolateral trunk. And we find that here because it is both inferior and lateral. So all the way up here we have the meningohypophyseal trunk, but as we come down, we have coming off the inferior and lateral surface of the vessel as well, the inferolateral trunk. which gives three to four small branches that supply the nearby cranial nerves. Here we see a branch going to V1, not the most common, but it's quite clear. So from here, the ICA comes up and passes through the proximal dural ring. And it's exiting the cavernous sinus and becoming both extracavernous and extradural. So we have C1 from the bifurcation to the carotid canal, C2 from the carotid canal to the posterior margin of foramen lacerum, giving off the carotid-tympanic and Vidian arteries. We have C3 from the foramen lacerum to the petrolingual ligament, giving off no branches. And we have C4 from the petrolingual ligament coming up, giving off the MHT up here, coming down, giving off the infralateral trunk down here, coming up, and going through, or ending at the proximal dural ring, and then the carotid's passing through the proximal dural ring, and it's exiting the cavernous sinus right here. So this proximal dural ring, together with all the meningeal architecture in this area, is really sealing that cavernous sinus off together. So now as we're exiting the cavernous sinus, we're becoming both extracavernous and extradural, and we enter the C5, or the clinoid segment. And of course, this is named the clinoid segment because we're now in the clinoid space where the anterior clinoid would normally cover. And this is a very small but very important segment of the carotid, and it extends from the proximal dural ring until the distal dural ring, which are both underneath the anterior clinoid process. And so what it means by being both extracavernous and extradural is that if you had a bleed here, it would not be a subarachnoid hemorrhage. So, and this segment ends at the distal dural ring, where the carotid does in fact enter the dura. So it differentiates the type of bleed as well. So here's our distal dural ring, and this is where the carotid now enters the dura and goes into the dura properly and becomes intradural. So let's take a closer look at this C5 region before we move intradural, excuse me. Okay. So again, here's where the foramen lacerum would be. This is the internal opening of the carotid canal, foramen lacerum. And this is the clivus. This is a right side ICA. Here's the anterior clinoid process. This is the sella, so this is where the pituitary would be. This is where the posterior clinoid process would be up here. So carotid's coming in. It's coming. This is where the petrolingual ligament would be right here. Actually, in some people, it's completely ossified, so it's solid bone. And as you come up, we have that first bend coming superiorly, coming up. We have our exit road, or the meningohypophyseal trunk. That's our first possible exit. Then we're going to come back down the slope, and we can exit if we wanted to go to the cranial nerves or exit the skull right here. A very easy way would be hop on the infralateral trunk, and it could take us out to the cranial nerves and to the foramen that are right there. If not, we come back up and we go underneath the anterior clinoid process, and we exit the cavernous sinus, and we go in between the proximal and distal dural rings. So if we look at this really nice illustration on the right, there's so much information you can glean from this. And we can see down here, this is the proximal dural ring. So you can see how this seals off the cavernous sinus. These lines here are supposed to represent the venous plexus of the cavernous sinus. And on the right, these would be the nerves here. So 3, 4, and V1. And this is the anterior clinoid process. So as we come up, we're exiting that cavernous sinus, and we're now extradural, extracavernous. As we enter the distal dural ring here, we enter the dura and become intradural. And both the proximal dura and the distal and proximal dural rings meet and connect posteriorly. And in many texts, you'll find this is referred to as the carotid collar. And it's not as confusing as many books and publications make it out to be. and it's technically challenging to deal with, but the anatomy here really isn't so complicated. And these rings join in the back, so you have to and you can open them up if you wanted to access this region. And the reason you would do so is because this is not an uncommon site for aneurysms. This is the carotid cave, the medial aspect of the carotid. So you can get a carotid cave aneurysm here. So you have to come in, shave down the anterior clinoid process, cut the distal dural ring, mobilize the carotid laterally, and you can expose the carotid cave. So before we move intradurally, until this point again, we have C1 cervical segment, we have the fork in the road we hop on the internal carotid artery highway. So we go from the C1 bifurcation all the way into our entrance into the carotid canal. We enter the carotid canal, we go into our tunnel, we have the Petrous segment, and we go in all the way straight up and we curve over. If we wanted to go to the middle ear, we can get on the carotid tympanic artery. If we wanted to go into the Vidian canal, we can hop on the Vidian artery. If not, we stay straight anteromedially. We emerge from the carotid canal underneath the trigeminal nerve, and on top of the foramen lacerum. We're in the lacerum segment now, which extends all the way up to the petrolingual ligament, which we'll find right here. So we want to go to the cavernous sinus. We take the bend of this road superiorly all the way up. We're intracavernous. We look up. We can see sixth nerve. On top of sixth nerve, we know there's V1 because those two run one on top of the other. And here's sixth nerve separated to show. As we go further, we're going to encounter fourth nerve on top of us. Then we can exit by the meningohypophyseal trunk if we're going to one of these small places around here. If not, we keep going. We come down. There's third nerve on top of us. Third nerve and fourth nerve can cross the carotid, 2 to 3 times in this region. And as we come down, if we wanted to exit and go to any of these little vascular outposts here to the cranial nerves exiting, we can hop on the infralateral trunk. If not, we stay on the carotid. So C4, petrolingual ligament, all the way to the proximal dural ring. And then we're underneath the anterior clinoid process. And we come up just immediately up to the anterior clinoid process, and then we're between the proximal and distal dural rings and the clinoid C5 segment. And then we can, if we wanted to go intradural, we can go through that distal dural ring. So before we move intradural, are there any questions?
Hey everyone, Ryan Rad here from Neurosurgerytraining.org. If you like that video, subscribe and donate to keep our content available for medical students across the world.